Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're tackling a story that, well, it's been hard to ignore. It's been all over the news, documentaries like Downfall. The case against Boeing really brought it home. We're talking about the Boeing 737X crashes, Lion Air 610, Ethiopian Airlines 302. Just tragic. 346 lives lost.
Absolutely devastating. And, you know, what our research shows, digging deep into this, is that these weren't just freak accidents or isolated technical failures.
Right, there's more to it.
Much more. They were symptoms, really tragic symptoms of a systemic failure within Boeing. A multi-decade problem, actually.
So that's our mission for this deep dive, then, to unpack that systemic failure.
Exactly. We've based this on a pretty comprehensive root problem analysis of Boeing's issues. We want to understand how this American icon, this giant of aviation, essentially, well, the sources say deorbited.
Deorbited, wow.
Yeah, and explore the really critical lessons here, especially about, prioritizing shareholder value above everything else in industries where safety just has to be paramount.
Okay, so a deep-rooted problem. Where do we start? How did Boeing even get to the point of the 737 MAX crisis? The analysis points to its origin story being less about innovation and more about panic.
Strategic panic, yes. That's the term used. It kicked off around 2010. And the trigger, Airbus.
Their main competitor.
Precisely. Airbus launched the A320neo, a new engine option, super fuel efficient. It just took the market by storm.
And Boeing felt the heat.
Immense heat, especially when American Airlines, a historically loyal Boeing customer, signaled they were about to place a massive order for the Airbus A320neo. Hundreds of them.
Ouch, that would hurt.
It was an existential threat. Suddenly, Boeing leadership was scrambling under intense pressure to respond, and fast.
And that scramble led to what the analysis calls the original sin of the MAX, this no new training promise.
Exactly. Instead of designing a completely new plane from scratch, a clean sheet design, which takes, 5, maybe 9 years and costs a fortune,
Right.
Boeing leadership, already kind of conditioned to focus on those quarterly earnings reports, went for the quicker, cheaper option. Modify the existing 737 airframe.
Okay, modify. But why was no new training the absolute key here?
Because that was the sales pitch, the core value proposition to the airlines. Fly the MAX with pilots already certified on the older 737 next generation, the NG, without needing expensive new full-flight simulator training.
Save the airlines time and money.
A lot of money. And it wasn't just a suggestion. Boeing made a contractual commitment, for instance, to Southwest Airlines, a penalty of $1 million.
Per plane.
Per plane delivered if the FAA ultimately required new simulator training. $1 million per plane.
Wow. Okay, so that marketing promise basically became an unbreakable engineering rule.
And an ironclad engineering constraint, it completely flipped the script. Usually engineering defines what's possible, then finance figures it out. Here, a financial commitment dictated the engineering.
So engineers were forced to somehow bolt these bigger, more fuel-efficient LAP engines onto an airframe designed back in the 1960s.
That doesn't sound ideal.
Far from ideal.
Yeah.
And it immediately created a problem, an aerodynamic one. Because of where the larger engines had to be mounted, slightly higher and further forward, the plane had a tendency to pitch its nose upward, especially at high angles of attack. Not how the old 737 NG handled.
Which would violate the no new training rule if pilots had to learn new handling characteristics.
Exactly. So Boeing needed a fix, and their solution was software. MCAS, Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System.
MCAS, the system that became so infamous.
That's the one. Its job was to automatically push the nose down in certain flight conditions, specifically high angles of attack, to make the MAX feel like the older NG to pilots, preserving that common type rating.
Okay, a software fix for a hardware problem. But the analysis highlights some absolutely critical flaws in MCS itself. This is where it gets really worrying, isn't it? Deeply worrying. The most crucial flaw. MCS relied on input from just one angle of attack sensor, a single AOA sensor.
Only one. No redundancy on a critical flight system.
No redundancy. So if that single sensor failed or gave a faulty reading, which they are known to do, sometimes MCS could activate erroneously, pushing the plane's nose down aggressively without any cross-check.
And the pilots wouldn't necessarily know why.
Especially because of the second major issue, what our sources call a culture of concealment around MCS. Boeing deliberately downplayed the system. To the FAA, to the airlines.
They didn't even put it in the pilot manuals initially, right?
They actively lobbied to keep it out. They wanted it to be invisible, seamless, so it wouldn't trigger that dreaded need for simulator training.
But surely during testing, they must have seen potential problems.
They did. There was a shocking internal simulator test result that came out later. A Boeing test pilot encountered an uncommanded MCS activation during a simulated failure scenario. It took him over 10 seconds to diagnose and counteract it. 10 seconds. He described the situation as catastrophic.
10 seconds. But isn't the standard assumption for pilot reaction time something like 4 seconds?
4 seconds, exactly. So this was more than double what regulations assume. And the most damning part, this critical information, this catastrophic finding.
Let me guess. They didn't share it with the FAA.
It was withheld. So fast forward to the actual crashes. Lion Air, Ethiopian Airlines. Pilots battling a powerful system they didn't fully understand, with potentially less than 10 seconds to react correctly.
A system they weren't even told about properly.
Precisely. So MCS wasn't just, a technical mistake. It was the end result of this normalization of deviance. Each bad decision, the software patch, the single sensor, the concealment was justified by the previous one, all driven by this initial financial and scheduling pressures.
Normalization of deviance, that really captures it. A gradual slide where dangerous compromises become acceptable.
So how did this become Boeing's way of operating? Where did this culture, this rot, actually begin? The analysis overwhelmingly points to one pivotal event: the 1997 merger with McDonnell Douglas.
Ah, the merger. I've heard this described almost like a reverse takeover.
That's a very common view. McDonnell Douglas was known for its aggressive, cost-cutting, finance-driven approach. And that ethos, after the merger, began to systematically displace Boeing's traditional engineering-first culture.
The culture that built Boeing's reputation for quality and safety.
Exactly. And it wasn't subtle. We found this quote from Harry Stonecipher, the former McDonnell Douglas CEO who then led the merged company. He actually said, "When people say I changed the culture of Boeing, that was the intent, so that it is run like a business rather than a great engineering firm."
Wow, he said that out loud.
Yeah.
Run like a business rather than a great engineering firm in aviation.
Stark, isn't it? And the effects, according to engineers and others inside Boeing at the time, were immediate and devastating. Stress levels shot up, morale plummeted.
A culture bypass, the sources call it.
Yeah, where the original values were just overridden. Profit became the main driver. It destroyed what sociologists call social capital, the trust, the shared norms, the pride in engineering excellence that had defined Boeing.
To the point where some engineers reportedly said they felt safer flying on an Airbus.
That anecdote appears in several accounts. It speaks volumes about the loss of faith within their own ranks.
And this new cult of shareholder value, as you put it, wasn't just about feelings or morale. It had tangible consequences for investment, didn't it? It actively starved the engineering side.
Absolutely. It led to financial decisions that look, frankly, like corporate self-harm in retrospect. The most glaring example is stock buybacks. But between 2013 and 2018, those absolutely critical years leading up to the MAX disasters, Boeing spent a staggering $41.5 billion buying back its own stock.
$41.5 billion.
Billion, with a B, money spent to boost the share price in the short term. Now compare that to investment in the future.
R&D, new factories.
Exactly. Capital expenditures, CapEx, actually plummeted during that period. It fell to less than 2% of sales. That's about half the rate of Airbus. R&D investment was basically flat or declining.
So they were spending fortunes propping up the stock price while underinvesting in the core business of designing and building safe airplanes.
It was corporate self-cannibalization, sacrificing long-term health, innovation, and potentially safety for short-term financial metrics.
And the executives making these decisions were benefiting personally, weren't they? Their compensation was tied to this.
Heavily tied. Executive pay, especially for the top leadership, was significantly linked to stock performance. Dennis Muhlenberg, the CEO during the MAX development and crashes, made at least $106 million, largely from stock awards linked to hitting those financial targets. And current CEO, David Calhoun, who was on the board during much of this, he pocketed over $64 million between 2020 and 2022. And he's publicly stated a goal of returning another $10 billion to shareholders by 2026. The incentive structure clearly prioritized shareholder returns.
It seems inescapable. And this divide between the financial focus and the engineering reality was even physically cemented, wasn't it, with the headquarters move?
That's right. In 2001, Boeing moved its corporate headquarters from Seattle, the heart of its engineering and manufacturing operations, all the way to Chicago.
thousands of miles away from the factory floor.
Some sources call it a decapitation. It created this physical and psychological distance. Leadership became insulated from the day-to-day realities, the challenges, the warnings coming from the engineers and mechanics.
They lost that hands-on feel, that finger spits and feel.
Exactly that. Intuitive feel. Information had to travel up layers of management. It got filtered, sanitized. A critical safety concern raised by a mechanic in Renton might just become a data point on a spreadsheet in Chicago. Abstract, easier to dismiss or deprioritize against financial targets.
This distance, this cultural decay, it had to show up on the factory floor eventually, right? And the analysis points to the 787 Dreamliner program as a kind of canary in the coal mine.
Absolutely. The Dreamliner, developed under this new philosophy with massive outsourcing, was meant to be cheaper and faster.
But it wasn't.
It backfired spectacularly. Huge communication problems between suppliers, parts that didn't fit together, a fragmented supply chain they couldn't control. The program ended up billions over budget and years behind schedule. Boeing even had to buy back some of its key suppliers just to regain control.
And the quality problems were serious, weren't they? Particularly at the South Carolina plant.
Really serious and documented. We're talking things like incorrect fasteners being used, significant gaps between fuselage sections, metal shavings left inside planes near critical wiring.
Shavings? Near wiring?
Yeah, reports of dented hydraulic tubes being installed, allegedly pulled from scrap bins. Even a whistleblower claimed that up to a quarter of the emergency oxygen systems on some planes might not function correctly.
These weren't just minor glitches. The FAA stepped in repeatedly, didn't they? Halted 787 deliveries.
They did, multiple times. These were bright red, flashing warning lights about the state of Boeing's production system years before the MAX crisis fully erupted.
And yet, the warnings seemingly weren't heeded at the highest levels. Maybe the most powerful evidence comes from the employees themselves, the ones who tried to speak up. The analysis paints a picture of a culture of fear.
A consistent and damning picture, yes. People who raised safety concerns faced retaliation. They were sidelined, ignored, punished.
Like Sam Salapore, quality engineer.
Right. He testified about witnessing workers on the 787 and 777 lines using excessive force. He called it the Tarzan effect, jumping on sections to make misaligned parts fit together.
Jumping on plane parts.
That was his testimony. And when he raised alarms, he says he was told to shut up, moved off the program, even threatened physically.
And then there's the tragic story of John Barnett.
Deeply tragic. A former quality manager at the 787 plant, he reported finding substandard parts, potentially from scrap bins, being installed on planes. He also flagged those potentially faulty oxygen systems.
And he faced retaliation.
He alleged years of harassment and retaliation after raising his concerns. And then, in March 2024, while he was actually in Charleston giving depositions for his whistleblower lawsuit against Boeing, he was found dead.
Officially ruled a suicide, but under very difficult circumstances.
Yes. And a note was reportedly found saying, among other things, "Frack Boeing, I pray Boeing pays." It's just chilling. Sends a terrible message to anyone thinking of speaking out.
Absolutely. And he wasn't the only one trying to warn them. There was Ed Pearson too, right? Before the MAX crashes even happened.
Ed Pearson, a former senior manager at the 737 factory in Renton, he saw the chaos on the production line as they were rushing to build the MAX. He described it as chaotic, dysfunctional, dangerous.
And he told leadership.
He pleaded with them multiple times, even suggesting they temporarily shut down production to fix the problems before the first crash. He was ignored. Later, especially after the Alaska Airlines incident, he accused Boeing of a criminal cover-up.
And more recently, another whistleblower, Sam Mohawk.
Yes, a current quality assurance inspector. He came forward alleging that Boeing has been losing track of hundreds of non-conforming parts that don't meet specifications, including potentially critical ones like rudders, and that he was told by supervisors to hide evidence from the FAA during inspections.
Losing track of faulty parts, hiding evidence. It sounds systemic.
It points to retaliation being an institutional tool. Using HR, using transfers, using intimidation to silence dissent. It broke that vital feedback loop. Warnings from the front line just weren't getting through, or they were actively suppressed.
Which brings us, inevitably, to January 5th, 2024, Alaska Airlines Flight 1282, that nearly new 737 MX-9.
Yeah, the mid-air blowout. Terrifying. A door plug panel just ripped off the fuselage at 16,000 feet. Miraculously, no one was killed.
And the National Transportation Safety Board, the NPSB, their initial finding was just Stunningly basic.
Almost unbelievable. The 4 critical bolts that were supposed to secure that door plug, they were missing.
Just not there.
Not there. It wasn't some complex software glitch or a rare material failure. It was basic assembly. Bolts not installed.
And the work had been done at Boeing's own factory in Renton, right? They'd removed the plug for some other work and hadn't put it back properly.
Correct. And, perhaps even worse, Boeing had no records. No documentation that the bolts had been removed or, crucially, that they'd been reinstalled and inspected. None.
So a failure of workmanship, a failure of process documentation, and a failure of inspection. A trifecta of failure, as the analysis puts it.
It laid bare a production system seemingly in collapse. It validated everything the whistleblowers like Pearson had been warning about, that the pressure to deliver planes, to meet schedules, was overriding the need to build them correctly and safely.
It seems impossible to talk about Boeing's failures without talking about the regulator, the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration. Their role seems critical here.
Absolutely critical. And the analysis suggests it wasn't just a case of the FAA being tricked or outmaneuvered by Boeing. It points to a deeper problem. Regulatory capture.
Regulatory capture, meaning the industry having too much influence over its regulator.
Essentially, yes. And a key mechanism for this, highlighted in the reports, was the FAA's Organizational Designation Authorization Program, ODA.
ODA, how does that work?
It delegates huge chunks of the aircraft certification process, the design approval, the inspections to the manufacturers themselves. Designated Boeing employees were essentially acting as the FAA, certifying their own company's work.
That sounds like a conflict of interest.
A profound and untenable conflict of interest, according to the congressional investigation. These Boeing employees, acting with FAA authority, faced immense pressure from their Boeing managers to approve designs, to sign off on things quickly, to meet those corporate deadlines and financial targets.
So loyalty to the company versus duty to the FAA and the public.
Exactly. And the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, after its 18-month investigation, found specific instances where these ODA members knew about potential safety issues, like with MCS, but failed to flag them properly to the FAA.
So the system designed for efficiency basically ended up with the fox guarding the henhouse.
That's the accusation. The FAA outsourced its eyes and ears, its technical capacity, and became overly reliant on, and perhaps too deferential to, Boeing.
That House committee report you mentioned from September 2020 sounds pretty damning overall.
It was, 238 pages. It concluded, and this is a direct quote, that the MAX crashes were a horrific culmination of faulty technical assumptions by Boeing's engineers, a lack of transparency on the part of Boeing's management, and grossly insufficient oversight by the FAA.
Faulty assumptions, lack of transparency, insufficient oversight, a failure across the board.
A symbiotic failure, they called it, for pretty much every failure on Boeing's part, like hiding that critical MCAS simulator data. There was a corresponding failure by the FAA, like not demanding that data or allowing Boeing to self-certify key aspects of the system. They identified 5 central themes: production pressures, the faulty MCS design, Boeing's concealment, the ODA conflicts, and Boeing's undue influence over the FAA.
Undue influence. How deep did that go?
According to the report, FAA senior managers actually overruled their own technical experts' safety concerns at Boeing's request. That shows the influence wasn't just external lobbying. It had penetrated the FAA's own decision-making structure.
Okay, so fast forward again. After the Alaska Airlines door plug incident, the FAA seemed to wake up, right? They talked tough, halted mass production expansion, sent in more inspectors.
Yes, definitely a much more aggressive public posture. They mandated a 90-day quality improvement plan for Boeing. And that 6-week audit they did in early 2024, the findings were pretty shocking.
That's the one where Boeing failed 33 out of 89 audits.
That's right. And the details were alarming. Inspectors saw mechanics using a hotel key card to check door seals because they didn't have the right tool, using Dawn dish soap as a lubricant on a door seal installation, just basic procedural lapses all over the place.
Dish soap, a key card on multi-million-dollar aircraft.
It points to systemic failures in manufacturing process control, product control, quality oversight, the very things that should be rock solid.
But here's the question. Is this increased scrutiny actually working? Is it too little, too late?
That is the critical question, because we also have a report from the Department of Transportation's own Inspector General from October 2024 saying the FAA's oversight processes are still fundamentally weak.
Still weak after all this.
And Senator Maria Cantwell made a really crucial point. She noted that the FAA had conducted almost 300 audits of Boeing and its key supplier Spirit Aerosystems before the Alaska incident, and none of them seemed to trigger meaningful, lasting enforcement or change.
So we have an audit paradox, as some call it. Lots of audits, lots of findings, but the core problems persist.
It certainly looks that way, which raises serious doubts about whether the current approach is enough to truly fix the deep-seated cultural and systemic issues.
So if the audits and current FAA actions might not be enough, what does the path to redemption actually look like? Boeing is making efforts, right?
Yeah.
They talk about a quality plan, more speak-up reports from employees, new safety committee on the board.
They are saying the right things, certainly. The speak-up submissions are up 500%, they say. They appointed a chief aerospace safety officer. CEO Dave Calhoun talks about slowing production to get this right.
But I sense a but coming.
Well, the independent analyses and even some internal data paint a more complicated picture. That FAA-appointed expert panel, they found a persistent disconnect between what senior management was saying and the reality experienced by workers on the factory floor.
The message isn't getting through, or it's not believed.
Possibly both. The panel noted that the Speak Up program seemed focused on the speak part, but maybe neglected the seek or listen parts actually acting on the concerns raised. And an internal Boeing survey from May 2024 still showed a majority of manufacturing employees feeling pressured by schedules to deviate from standards.
So the pressure is still there, despite the talk.
And crucially, look at the executive incentives again. That structure is still largely the same. Safety metrics make up only about 4% of the annual bonus calculations.
Only 4%.
Roughly. It suggests, perhaps, a focus on the semantics of safety. The programs, the reports, the language, rather than the harder, more expensive changes to the fundamental structure of safety, like incentives and production priorities.
Okay, so if those efforts are potentially falling short, what would genuine systemic change actually involve? What do the analyses recommend?
The recommendations are broad, targeting Boeing, the FAA, and even the wider industry. For Boeing itself, it starts at the top: governance and culture.
Like the board of directors.
Exactly. Overhaul the board, bring in more independent members with deep aerospace, engineering, and safety expertise, not just finance backgrounds. Restructure executive pay so that long-term safety, quality, and engineering metrics are heavily weighted, not just short-term stock price.
And that headquarters move.
Symbolically, but also practically, moving corporate HQ back from Chicago to Seattle. Reunite the leadership with the engineering and manufacturing base. Bridge that gap we talked about.
Makes sense. And operationally, on the ground.
A big one. Publicly commit to and start funding a true clean sheet replacement for the 737. Signal a genuine return to engineering-led design.
Move beyond modifying that 1960s airframe.
Yes. And critically, reinforce vital functions. Bring critical design work, manufacturing processes, and especially quality control back in-house, reducing reliance on that complex, fragmented supply chain that caused so many problems with the 787 and MAX-Es.
Take that control.
Empower a chief engineer. Give them real authority, reporting directly to the CEO, with the power to veto decisions on safety grounds, overriding schedule or cost pressures. And finally, create a truly non-punitive safety reporting system, maybe protected by the union, independently audited, so employees feel genuinely safe raising concerns without fear of retaliation.
Okay, that's a lot for Boeing. What about the FAA's role in this redemption?
Regulatory reform is key. That ODA program needs fundamental change, maybe even replacement. Critical safety certification should be done directly by FAA employees, or at least under much stricter, unconflicted supervision.
Which means the FAA needs more resources.
Absolutely. Congress needs to step up with significant direct funding for the FAA to hire and retain many more expert on-site inspectors. They can't rely so heavily on delegation anymore.
And enforcement, if they find the problem.
They need real teeth. An escalating framework of consequences for non-compliance. That has to include the credible threat of halting production lines until root causes are fully addressed and verified. Not just fines, but real operational impact. And, like for Boeing, an independent, legally protected channel for whistleblowers to report concerns directly to the regulator.
And beyond Boeing and the FAA, the recommendations mention the wider industry.
Yes, looking at the market structure itself, There's a call for a formal investigation into the effects of the global aerospace duopoly, just Boeing and Airbus dominating the large airliner market. Does that lack of competition stifle innovation and potentially compromise safety standards due to the immense pressure?
Interesting question.
And using this whole Boeing saga as a crucial case study, really examining the ethical boundaries of maximizing shareholder value when you're operating in fields where public safety is non-negotiable, reasserting the importance of stakeholder responsibility, employees, customers, the public, not just shareholders.
So wrapping this up, the story of Boeing's recent troubles, it's not just about a faulty sensor or missing bolts, is it?
Not at all. It's a story of profound systemic failure. Our analysis points to a corrosive cultural decay over decades. It started with that McDonnell Douglas merger, bringing in a cost-first mindset, fueled by financial strategies that, frankly, cannibalized Boeing's engineering strength to boost the stock price, and enabled by a regulator that became too close, too captured to do its job effectively.
And the 346 deaths, the Alaska Airlines incident, these weren't bolts from the blue. They were the predictable, maybe even inevitable outcomes of that broken system.
Tragically, yes. Now, Boeing is at a critical juncture. The global demand for new airplanes over the next 20 years is massive. Something like 44,000 new planes are forecast, a huge market.
But can Boeing capture its share? Can it rebuild that shattered trust?
That is the multi-billion-dollar question. True redemption, based on everything we've looked at, requires more than apologies and new programs. It demands a painful, honest, fundamental transformation.
A return to basics.
A return to the core principle that in aviation, safety isn't just a priority you balance against costs or schedules. It has to be the absolute, non-negotiable precondition for even existing as a company.
So the final thought we want to leave you, the listener, with is this. Is the real question whether Boeing can change? Or is it whether the current leadership, the board, the pressures of Wall Street, and maybe even the limitations of our regulatory structures will actually allow it to make the deep fundamental changes required?
What does the fate of this American industrial icon tell us about that larger tension? The conflict between engineering integrity, long-term thinking, safety, and the relentless, often short-sighted pressures of modern capitalism. Something to think about.